is the soft drumming of rain on the roof. Let the sound draw you inward. Feel your breath settle, your heart quiet, your mind begin to drift. And when you're ready, we'll begin tonight's story.
Welcome to tonight's bedtime story. Wherever you are, I invite you to settle in, find your quiet place, and let the day fall away. The lamps are dim, the air is still, and for the next little while there's nowhere you have to be. Except here. Tonight's story is about memory, the way it changes us, reshapes the truth, and holds us even when everything else begins to fade. It's about the stories we tell and the reasons we tell them. Not to boast, but to belong. You might remember a story from long ago about a young girl, a storm, and a road made of yellow brick. It was a story of courage and friendship and finding one's way home. But tonight's story begins long after the adventure ended. It begins with that same girl, grown old, sitting beside her window as the wind moves through the fields of Kansas again. The world no longer believes her tales, and even she isn't sure what parts are memory and what parts are dream. All she knows is that the story is still inside her, bright as ever, and that it's the one thing that keeps her company when the nights grow long. So, as you listen, imagine the hush of an old farmhouse, the smell of lilacs and rain, a wooden chair creaking softly as an old woman turns the page of her notebook, smiling to herself before she begins. It started with the wind. And from there, let the story carry you where it will, through memory, through longing, through the quiet places where truth and imagination meet. Because sometimes the stories we invent are the truest ones of all.
I found them in the cedar chest after the funeral. They were smaller than I'd imagined, no brighter than the moonlight that slipped through the attic window, soft and dust-flecked, glimmering just enough to make me wonder if they were ever real. Silver shoes, not the red ones from the stories everyone knows, but worn, faded silver, the color of old spoons and evening mist. The stitching along the sides had loosened, and one buckle was hanging by a thread. When I lifted them out, a faint scent of lilacs and wood polish rose from the chest, the scent of my grandmother's house. She'd always said not to go poking through her things. Every chest keeps its secrets, she'd laugh, waving her hand as though there were treasures she meant to protect. But now she was gone, and the house was quiet, except for the sound of rain tapping against the roof. I carried the shoes downstairs and set them on the table beside her old teacup, the one with the chip along the rim. I half expected her to come into the room, brushing flour from her apron, ready to scold me for touching what wasn't mine. Instead, there was only the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the kitchen clock, the same sounds that had filled her house for as long as I could remember. I don't know what made me slip my hand into one of the shoes. Maybe curiosity, maybe longing. The lining inside was soft, frayed velvet, cool to the touch. For a moment, I thought I heard something. The faintest whisper of wind, distant but insistent, like the breath of an old storm. And then I remembered her voice. My grandmother had loved to tell stories, especially when the nights were long and the electricity threatened to go out. She'd sit by the window with a blanket around her shoulders, a cup of tea steaming beside her, and we'd gather at her feet, like her audience. Did I ever tell you, she'd begin, about the day the wind came for me? We'd giggle, of course, all children do. We thought she was teasing us, but her face would go quiet then, her eyes fixed on something far away. I was just about your age, she'd say softly, and the sky turned green. That's how you know it's coming, when the light goes green. She never said the word tornado. She never used the word Oz. She called it the other place. In her stories, there were fields that sang when the wind touched them, and a man made of tin who cried when he laughed, and a lion whose paws shook so badly that she had to walk beside him, whispering, "You're doing fine." When we asked if it really happened, she'd smile. "Every story is true," she'd say. "Some just take longer to prove it." I don't think I ever believed her, not fully, not until I found those shoes. The light outside flickered as thunder rolled far off in the distance. For a moment, the kitchen felt the way her stories used to, suspended between then and now, between make-believe and memory. I sat there for a long time, staring at the silver shoes, wondering how much of her story had been real, and how much she had simply needed to believe. And that's when I decided to tell it again, not the way the world remembers it, but the way she did, the way she remembered it. My grandmother used to say that children are like weeds. They grow best when someone remembers to water them. But when she was a girl, no one remembered very often. After the storm, the great one that carried her house clean across the county, the one people whispered about for years, the family grew larger. Her aunt and uncle took in 2 cousins whose parents had fallen ill, and then a baby that belonged to a neighbor who'd gone west to find work and never returned. There were beds lined up along the wall, like train cars, and Dorothy was squeezed into one of them, her dreams pressed thin by elbows and sighs. "I used to think the wind forgot about me," she told me once. It remembered the house, but not the girl inside it. In those years, attention was something rationed like sugar, a teaspoon here, a kind word there. So Dorothy learned that the surest way to be seen was to have a story to tell. She'd stand on the porch while her aunt hung laundry, spinning tales about the chickens that could talk, or the scarecrow that danced when no one was looking. Her aunt would swat at the air with a clothespin and say, "Mercy, child, you and your stories." But the corner of her mouth would lift just a little, and that was enough. Dorothy learned early that people smiled when she gave them wonder, even if they didn't believe it. As she grew older, the stories grew with her. They began to gather names, colors, and places that didn't exist on any map. The yellow road appeared first, though back when she described it as made of painted boards, not bricks. The man of tin came later, borrowed from the broken stovepipe that leaned against the barn. And the lion, well, that one was a dream she'd had, she said, after the baby cried all night and she fell asleep on the kitchen floor. He was frightened, she said of the lion, frightened all the time, but he kept walking anyway. I like that about him. The way she told it, it wasn't a fairy tale at all. It was a collection of small truths, polished and rearranged until they began to sound like something that could almost be magic. By the time she was 17, Dorothy's stories had become the way she entered every room. The other children had grown and scattered, the fields had turned over year after year, and she remained the girl with the storm still in her eyes. When neighbors came by, she'd pour lemonade and talk about faraway cities, wizards with trembling hands, and friends who'd once followed her along the golden road. They'd laugh, and she'd laugh too, though she always laughed last and a little softer. "You make it sound so real," they'd say. "Maybe it is," she replied, and glanced toward the horizon, as if the wind might come for her again. But life went on, as life does. There were harvests and weddings, births and funerals, and in the space between, Dorothy kept her stories alive. When she married, she told her husband about the storm. He chuckled and kissed her temple. "You were a brave girl," he said kindly, as if humoring a child. She never told him the part about being scared. When her children were born, she softened the story further, trimming away the darker edges. The witch became a cranky old woman with greenish fingers. The wizard turned into a harmless man with spectacles too large for his face. And Dorothy herself, oh, she became the heroine. Because children like happy endings, she once told me, stirring sugar into her tea. I think she told it that way so they would be proud of her. But pride is a fragile thing. When the children grew up, they stopped asking for her stories. They had their own storms, their own roads to walk. And that's when the stories started changing again, not to entertain, but to comfort. She told them to the empty room. She told them to the kettle as it boiled. She told them to the wind. And with each retelling, the colors deepened, the road grew longer, and the girl she used to be became braver and braver. "The more I told it," she said to me once, "the truer it felt." I asked her if she still remembered how it really happened, the house, the storm, the fall. She smiled. "Oh, I remember," she said, "but I like my version better." That was her gift, I think, to find light where there wasn't any, and to polish it until it glowed. Sometimes I wonder if that's what Oz really was, a place made out of all the things she wished were true. On nights when I can't sleep, I think about her sitting by that same window, the rain tapping softly, her hands folded in her lap as she begins her story again. "It started with the wind," she'd say, "and even now I can almost hear it rise." There were nights when Grandma's stories drifted through the house long after we'd gone to bed. I'd lie under the quilt, the old ceiling fan whispering above me, and hear her voice carry softly down the hallway. The rise and fall of it, the small laughter in the pauses. It was a sound I came to know by heart. She didn't tell her stories just to pass the time. I think she told them to keep herself company. The words filled the empty spaces the way light fills a doorway. Sometimes I'd sneak out of bed and stand in the hall, half hidden in shadow, watching her silhouette in the lamplight. Her head tilted slightly, her hand tracing small circles in the air as she spoke. There was something tender in it, like she was talking to someone she missed. I remember wondering who she was telling it to. Maybe to the friends she left behind in that other place. Maybe to the little girl she used to be. She never saw me standing there, listening, or maybe she did and just pretended not to. Either way, I'd wait until her voice slowed and the teacup clicked gently against the saucer. And then I'd tiptoe back to bed, the story still echoing faintly in my head. The next morning she'd ask if I slept well, and I'd nod. But what I wanted to say was, "Yes, and your voice followed me into my dreams." I think that's what stories are for, to follow us, even when we think we've let them go, to remind us that we belong to something larger than silence. The older I grew, the more I noticed the pauses. Grandma would sit in her rocking chair by the window, telling the story for what must have been the 100th time, and somewhere between the road of gold and the wizard's booming voice, her eyes would drift away. The words would keep coming, but her mind would go somewhere else, somewhere softer, quieter. "When I met the wizard," she'd say, "he was trembling behind a curtain." "Why was he afraid of you?" I asked once. She hesitated. "Because I'd done something terrible," she said, then smiled quickly. "Or maybe something wonderful. It's hard to tell the difference after so many years." Then she reached for her cup of tea, her hand shaking just enough for the spoon to rattle. At first I thought it was just age, but later I realized it was memory trying to steady itself. I began reading every version of her story I could find. The one in the old library book, the one the movie made bright and loud and easy to love. None of them matched hers. In the books, the house falls on a witch. In Grandma's version, there's only a noise like thunder and a strange stillness afterward. She never mentioned death, only the sudden quiet. It was so still, she once whispered, her voice barely there. Even the wind stopped to listen. I remember the way she looked at me then, half defiant, half pleading, as if daring me to ask what she meant. I didn't. Over time, I began to understand that her story had been edited by kindness, not for fame, but for mercy. Mercy for the frightened girl she had been, standing in the ruins of her own house. Mercy for the woman who had lived with that silence ever since. So she made herself brave in the retelling, because bravery was easier to live with than guilt. I saved them, she'd say, smiling. That's what everyone said. And then, more quietly, and if everyone says it, maybe it's true. The wizard, too, changed with time. In her later tellings, he became smaller, frailer, almost pitiful. He was just a man, she said. He meant well. I think she saw something of herself in him, a person who'd built a grand story just to survive inside it. Once, when I was a teenager, I asked her outright, "Grandma, were you really as brave as you say?" She laughed, a soft sound, almost musical. "Brave enough," she said. Then she reached over and brushed a bit of hair from my face. "That's all anyone ever is, darling. Brave enough." I never forgot that. It changed the way I listened after that night. I stopped trying to separate what was fact from what was fancy. The truth wasn't in the details anyway. It was in the feeling behind her words, the way her voice softened when she spoke of home, the way her hands trembled when she said goodbye to her friends at the end of the tale. Somewhere between those trembling hands and that faraway smile, I found the real Dorothy, the one the books never mentioned, the one that came home to a house full of new children and learned how to make herself visible again, the one who built her courage out of stories, the one who kept a whole world alive simply by refusing to let it fade. And I think she believed, truly, that as long as she kept telling it, the wind would remember her. That someday, when the clouds gathered and the sky turned that familiar shade of green, it would come for her one last time and carry her somewhere gentler, somewhere she could rest. After Grandma passed, the house sat empty for a while. The rooms felt smaller without her stories to fill them, as though the walls themselves were waiting to be spoken to again. I spent a week there sorting through her things, the teacups, the books, the little souvenirs she'd picked up from every thrift shop and church bazaar in the county. Most of it went quietly into boxes, but the cedar chest stayed open at the foot of her bed, the silver shoes resting inside like something sacred. On the last night a storm came, one of those spring tempests that make the windows tremble in their frames. The wind rose up again and circled the house, and for a moment I swear I could smell lilacs again. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the shoes into my lap. They were lighter than I remembered, almost weightless. I thought about her stories, how they had changed over the years, how she had polished them until they shone. She once told me that stories are like lanterns. You carry them until the flame goes out, and then someone else lights it again. I think that night the wind was lighting it for me. I opened one of her old notebooks, the one bound in cracked blue leather, the one she used to keep beside her chair. Inside there were sketches, a heart, a key, a few clumsy stars, and on the very last page, in faint pencil, a single sentence. It was all real to me. I don't know why, but I cried then. Not the heavy kind of crying that hurts, but the quiet kind that feels like rain sliding down a window pane. Because that's what truth is, isn't it? Not something fixed, but something that feels real when you're living it. I carried the notebook to the porch. The storm had eased, and the air was thick and green, the way she'd always described it, that strange light that comes before the world exhales. Somewhere out in the fields, a low rumble of thunder lingered, and the smell of wet earth rose like memory itself. I sat there for a long time, holding the notebook against my chest. "You were brave enough," I whispered. The wind shifted, soft and cool, brushing against my face like a sigh. And maybe it's foolish, but I could almost hear her voice, faint and far away, the way it sounded when she'd tell her story by lamplight. It started with the wind. Now, when my own granddaughter asks for a story before bed, I sometimes tell hers. Not the movie version, not the one in the library book, but the one that lived in her voice. I tell it the way she told it to me, about a girl who was lost, who made herself brave, who came home again and learned how to stay. And when I reach the end, I always add one last line of my own. Every story is true, I say. Some just take longer to remember. Then I turn off the lamp and let the room fall quiet. Outside, the night breathes softly, and far across the fields, the wind begins to stir again. Not loud, not wild, just enough to remind me that some stories never really end.
And that was the way she remembered it. A story about a woman who once went where the wind carried her, and about the generations who kept her story alive, even after she was gone. Maybe, as you rest tonight, you'll think of someone in your own life who loved to tell stories, a parent, a grandparent, an old friend, someone whose words lingered in the air long after they'd finished speaking. Maybe you'll remember the way their voice softened on certain words, or the way their eyes looked past you toward something they could still see. That's what stories do. They keep us tethered to one another, across years, across distance, across time. They remind us that we were here. And perhaps, like Dorothy, we all add a little magic to our memories, not to deceive, but to make them shine just enough to find our way by. The night outside is quiet now. The rain has eased. The wind has gone to sleep. Let it carry you too, gently, into your own dreaming, where the lines between real and imagined fade softly until all that's left is peace. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe. Good night, sleep well,